Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm sorry there's been a little bit of a delay getting in. We did have 10 minutes on the programme build for me to introduce all of this, partly in order to allow a little bit of time for everybody to get in, but there will be a few things I need to say as we get started. I'm John Hills. I'm co-director with Mike Savage, whom you'll be hearing from in a moment, of the International Inequalities Institute. Here at LSE. I'm also part of the LSE's Social Policy Department. I think just this morning, I think some of you may be aware that a major tragedy has been unfolding in West London overnight with a fire in a tower block. So I think it's appropriate to start just with a very short moment of silence, thinking of those who've been affected by that event. But what we have today is a day where we're talking also about very serious subjects, but I hope talking about solutions and things that may offer some hope in the very difficult situation that many of our countries find themselves in. So a big welcome to those of you who are already here this morning. A welcome to those of you who are watching this on the video podcast afterwards. This, like our other events, will be video recorded and will be available for people to watch on our website and in the intervals between the sessions. You'll see scrolling up on the screen some of the other speakers we've had recently that you can watch on our website. We're looking forward to, I think, a tremendous day and something that has been made possible through the support of the Atlantic philanthropies that you'll hear more about during the day. Just in terms of basic housekeeping, there will be tea and coffee available outside through the morning. There will be lunch available outside for those of you who are staying on the afternoon, or maybe those of you who are just leaving. After the morning session, that'll be available outside. That's between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and there'll be tea available in a break at 3:30 this afternoon. And then, for those of you who are still here, there'll be a reception at 5:30 outside again this afternoon in advance of the 6:30 evening session, for those of you who've got tickets for it. It is a tight schedule, even before we started a little late, so please do be back in good time from all the breaks. I should say, by the way, that toilets, if you go up to the top of the stairs and out of the lecture theatre, toilets are off to the right. If you do have a ticket for this evening, which was heavily oversubscribed, please try and make your way back in around 6:15, 6:20. Otherwise, it's possible, out of the reception, otherwise it's possible your seat may be given to somebody else. If, unfortunately, you weren't able to get a ticket for this evening's session, there will be an overflow room. I'm not quite sure where that is. We'll announce where that is. But it will also be live streamed, and it will, so people who aren't able to get in this evening will be able to watch that. I also have to say that because this morning and this morning's session and this afternoon's session and the evening session are separately ticketed, and there are different groups of people coming to each of those sessions, security have asked, would you mind taking your bags and coats with you outside at the end of the morning? And then bring back in again. There is a cloakroom outside that will be open through the day, although not in the evening. If you are tweeting, the hashtag for the conference is #LSEIII. Those are capital I's, 2017. But even if you are tweeting, please could you turn your mobiles to silent. Otherwise, they'll be permanently recorded on our website. You may not want that. You'll see in your pack a detailed programme of the day, which has got a lot of information about the speakers, so we won't be giving long introductions to our extremely distinguished speakers during the day. In many ways, this is a celebration of the existence and the beginning of all of the Atlantic Fellows programmes that the Atlantic philanthropies have so generously supported across the world, and particular welcome to those of you from our sister programs, other Atlantic Fellows programs. You'll see information about those other programs in the small blue brochure. And I'd like to give a particular welcome to the members of our very first cohorts of Atlantic Fellows who are joining our program, some joining in July, some joining in September. And you'll see more information about our program also in the pack and about our incoming fellows. And I'm sure they're all labelled and their photographs are in the pack. So I'm sure they'll be happy to tell you more about their work and the exciting things they've been doing before they've been coming here. So we've got a very full program today. Several of the sessions we have later on are linked to the themes of some of the other Atlantic Fellows programs. So we have a program on issues connected with racial equity in particular in the afternoon session, which is one of the themes of one of the programs, with health equity. And then this evening's panel debate is around the theme of narratives and about how in many parts of the world the political narrative media discussion around inequality and around things driving our societies have taken one direction, and what can be done maybe to send it in another direction. We're also going to hear from some doctoral students from both from the London School of Economics and from our partner university, the University of Cape Town, in the session after that. And we'll be hearing from we'll be hearing from the first visiting fellows teams that are going to be spending time over the coming year within the Inequalities Institute, working teams of academics, but also teams of academics with practitioners. And they'll tell you a little bit about the work they're going to be doing over the year before lunch. And then at the end of the day, we will have the presentation of the very first Action for Equity Award, which is a prize awarded to an organisation, a voluntary or charitable organisation that's been working to combat inequality in different ways. And we'll hear about the work of the three shortlisted organisations during that session, and then we'll discover who has won that award. And then at the end of the day's proceedings, Chris Exley, the Chief Executive of Atlantic Philanthropies, to him and of course to Chuck Feeney, who established Atlantic Philanthropies, we all owe a tremendous amount. So our first session is around issues that are central to our own programme within LSE. That is about what's been happening to people's life opportunities and what's been happening to links between generations. Does advantage in one generation pass itself on to advantage in other generations? We know that's true, but how is that changing in the USA? What are its effects in the UK? How does it compare across different parts of Europe? Jane Waldfogel will be talking first, followed by my colleague Mike Savage, and then Anna Ludvinek from the European Foundation for Working and Living Conditions. And then I'm delighted that Faiza Shaheen from CLASS has agreed to start off the discussion of what we do about those problems. So first, to start us off, a huge welcome to Jane Waldfogel from Columbia University, but also a frequent visitor to LSE. It's a great pleasure to have you start us off today. Thank you, Jane.
Very much. It's great to be here today and to be able to speak at the International Inequalities Institute. Congratulations to all of you here at the LSE and your partners on such a great initiative. Oh God, I've been editing myself to not use the word great anymore. So on such a terrific initiative, it's really hard work for an American to excise that word, but I've been working so hard at it. I can't believe I just slipped. So I'm going to talk about whether destinies are diverging in the United States, are patterns similar across countries, and what can we do to reduce educational inequalities, which are the main focus of what I'll be talking about this morning. I'm talking about educational inequalities because they are one of the most important drivers of social and economic inequalities. And actually, over recent decades, racial and ethnic gaps in achievement in the United States have narrowed. So that's the good news. But unfortunately, what's widened in recent decades is achievement gaps between children from low and high socioeconomic status families. By socioeconomic status, I mean either high education or high income, and you'll see the literature goes back and forth in how they measure SES. But of course, the two things are linked, high income and high education. So Sean Reardon, a sociologist at Stanford, has done this really amazing work using all the cohorts that we have in the United States and looking at what's the gap in educational test scores, in this case reading test scores, between children at the very top and children at the very bottom of the income distribution. So children whose families are at the 90th percentile of the income distribution, children whose families are at the 10th percentile of the income distribution. So it's a pretty extreme comparison. But for those who are familiar with the inequality literature, we always do this. We often compare the 90-10 and look at differentials. So back in 1940, 1950, there was a gap already of a little over half a standard deviation. That's a big gap between children who, in reading scores, between children whose families were at the top and the bottom of the income distribution. That's now risen to about 1.25 standard deviations around 2000. So this is a big growth in educational inequality. I'm going to ignore for the moment the last few years on this graph, but you can see that actually it's turning down. So there's a little bit of narrowing, but even in the last period, there's a full standard deviation difference in reading scores between children from the richest and the poorest families. And that's going to affect their life chances in tremendous ways. These gaps in achievement are paralleled by growing gaps in family resources, what Sarah McClanahan has called diverging destinies. And so what Sarah did was she tracked family resources and looked at their connection with measures of SES. And in her case, she was looking at education, not income. But it's a similar story. So back in 1960, this is plotting the mother's age at the time when the child is young. So young mothers are more disadvantaged on average. Back in 1960, there wasn't much difference in mother's age, depending on whether you had a low-educated, a middle-educated, or a high-educated mother. But this then fans out, right, over the ensuing years. And by 2010, there's a tremendous gap in the likelihood of having a young mother, depending on whether you're high-educated or low-educated. So increasingly, parental education, SES, is correlated with other aspects of family resources, in this case, having a young mother. Same thing for having a single mother, even more dramatic, right? Back in 1960, single motherhood was rare, almost equally likely, depending on whether you had a low-educated or high-educated mother. Fast forward to 2010, and the likelihood diverges considerably. And then, of course, most concerningly, the same pattern for family income. In this case, Sarah had data only up to 2000. She hasn't updated it, but you can see already by 2000 it's concerning. Back in 1960, yes, incomes are twice as high for the most educated families, but by 2000, they're 4 times as high. So the income gaps have doubled. So this is not just about family resources, but it's also about direct investments in children. As families have more resources, they're also more able to invest in children. So this shows us expenditures on what we think of as enrichment items, books and toys, child care, developmental items for children. Back in the 1970s, high-income families, now we're back to income, people switch back and forth. High-income families were spending 4 times as much as low-income families. By the mid-2000s, that's now 8 times as much. So again, the gap has doubled. This is work by 2 economists, Duncan and Murnane, and then in work by a political scientist, Bob Putnam, in his book, Our Kids. He looks at time in developmental child care, by which he means reading to children, time that you spend reading to children. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, there's not much of a differential. Now we're back to education between high-educated, low-educated parents. By the 2000s, a gap has opened up in how many minutes a day parents are reading to their children. So you get the story. So this is of great concern to us in the United States, and one question that comes up is this kind of story similar in other countries? These high levels of inequality that we're now at in the United States, the standard deviation gap in outcomes between high and low SES children, do we find this in other countries? Is there something inevitable about this, or is this something particular to what's going on in the States? So 4 of us, Bruce Bradbury from Australia, Miles Korak from Canada, Liz Washbrook from Bristol, and I from the US, used cohort data to look at this across countries and to trace out the links between family resources and children's achievement across these 4 very comparable countries. So we had to use cohort data because you can't really do this with cross-sectional data. You can't do it with P's or Pearls and Tim's because you need lots of rich data about the families. So we went back and forth. How do we measure SES? We decided to measure it with parental education. So we spent a lot of time coding up families. So we established common groups across countries. The low SES group, it's not the poorest families. It's actually about the bottom third of the distribution in our countries, in the US and the UK. It's 35 to 40% of the distribution is low SES as we're defining it. Then there's a middle group that's about a third, and then there's a top group, the high SES, that's about another third. So we're not comparing extremes of the distribution. So when you see how big these gaps are, it's not because we're comparing very poor and very rich families. This is really the top third to the bottom third. So we look at a host of resources, and the story is almost always that there's the most inequality in the US, followed by second place is almost always the UK, I'm sorry to say. So this is teen motherhood, and you can see there's a gradient here. So in the high educated families, it's very rare, only 3% have a teen mother. This rises to 20% in the low educated families, so that's the gradient. And you can see all the other countries have a gradient, but nothing like the US, and second place would be the UK, right? Second most inequality. Similar for children living with both biological parents. This is strongly correlated with parental education, but more so in the United States and with higher levels of single parenthood in the United States, again followed by the UK. This is immigrant parents. This is a little different. The UK actually stands out here in having relatively similar shares of immigrant parents across the education group. So whether you're low, medium, or high educated, about 15, 16% of parents are immigrants in the UK. That's not the case in the US, where immigrant parents especially are concentrated in our low educated group. So children who have a low educated parent in the US are also more likely to have a parent who was not born in the US, who may not speak English fluently, may not be familiar with our school system. Australia and Canada are just the opposite. So they have selective immigration, so if anything, their immigrants are more concentrated in the high educated group. This is developmental time. This is time reading with children. You can see there's a gradient in every country. The more educated the parent, the more they're also reading to children. I don't know what's going on in Canada. They're reading a lot to their kids. So the lowest educated parents in Canada, these guys are reading as much as the highest educated parents in the United States. They're right across our border. So something's going on. I've asked Canadians about this, and it's just second nature for them. They can't even explain why they have a culture that emphasizes reading so much. The UK also actually looks way better than the United States on this, so that is one piece of good news. And here's the income picture. So this is the income gradient, steepest in the United States, and it's steepest in the United States because the high educated families have very high incomes, higher than in the other countries, and the low educated families have the lowest incomes, lower than in any other country. Although this is the UK, this line that overlaps with the US, that's the UK. So the UK is a close runner-up in terms of the extent of income inequality. And then, unfortunately, another part of the story for the US is what the safety net is doing. So in the UK, in Australia and Canada, we're showing this is what child poverty would be before government steps in, before taxes and transfers. This is child poverty after government steps in, after taxes and transfers. In all of these countries, poverty is cut about in half, except in the US. The US, we put hardly a dent into child poverty with our taxes and transfers. So the reason we have a much higher child poverty rate is that we do much less with our safety net. That's what's going on. And then, of course, another aspect of policy that would be important around educational achievement would be the provision of universal preschool, another place where the UK does better than the US. So this is universal preschool, equalizing enrollment across the education groups. This is the US with a gradient. In that case, Canada is similar to us, or at least Canada as a nation. It depends on the province within Canada. Okay, so this is the picture of the achievement gaps, and you should not be surprised, given what we've seen about resources, to see that the gaps are largest in the United States, followed by the UK, followed by the other two countries. So this is the standard deviation gap in reading in the United States. This is the standard deviation gap in math in the United States at the time children start school at age 5. So this has nothing to do with school systems. This is all about early childhood. Children are already starting school with a standard deviation gap. And remember, this is between the top third and the bottom third. This is not extremes. This half a standard deviation gap is between the top and the middle. This other half is between the middle and the bottom. So that's how to read these graphs. But the full graph, the full bar, is about a standard deviation. So that's the gap. The UK is significantly smaller than the US, this gap. It's about 0.8. So the UK does look significantly better in terms of the size of its achievement gap than the US, but it's significantly worse than Australia, which has less than a half a standard deviation gap by the time children start school. And Canada also is lower, about 0.6. So this absolutely tracks the pictures we've seen around family resources and incomes. Unfortunately, as children move through school, the picture is very similar. This is age 7. You might say, no, that's not. That's age 5 again. It's not actually. It's age 7 and 9. And this is age 11. There's maybe a hint here that the UK is improving relative to Australia at this age. There is some narrowing in primary school in the UK. There is something that goes on that actually reduces these achievement gaps with all the different primary school measures, at least at the time of this cohort. So that is one piece of good news within the UK. But if anything, the gaps in the US grow larger, and actually in all the countries, the gaps grow larger by age 11 relative to what they should be. Okay, so this is a big problem in terms of inequalities already at school entry, and they don't really get smaller during school, except maybe in primary school in the UK. So what can we do about it? Well, we obviously have to do something in early childhood, because these gaps are starting early. So whether it's evidence-based parenting programs or preschool programs or both, we have to do more around early learning. I think we have to do something about income support programs. The best preschool and parenting programs in the world will still not be fully effective if parents are struggling to manage their finances, can't afford their rent, can't afford food, are homeless. So I think income support is important too. And then obviously we have to do something about the quality of teaching and learning in schools, because this process continues as children move through school. So this is sobering. The picture is not good for the US. It's also not very good for the UK. The comparative exercise, I think, was useful because it shows us that this is not inevitable. In our closest peer countries, things actually look different. There's much less inequality in early childhood among similar families, comparing like to like. So I think we could do a lot better. And I have to say, I'm encouraged by the recent trends in the United States. We still have a standard deviation gap, but that's coming down from 1.25 standard deviation. So since nobody's flagged me to say time, I'll just show you the pictures. This is the improvement in the gap in the US, and this is what we think is going on. So I showed you those gradients in parents' investments in children and home resources between low and high SES families. So this is, for example, the reading. This is the share of parents who are reading books at least 3 times a week with their children across the income distribution. So this is the lowest income families. These are the highest income families. And this picture, the lighter dotted line, is from 1998 children. The children actually we analyzed in the book. These are the higher line, the more dark line, is children entering kindergarten in fall of 2010, so more recent cohort. So there's been a shift in reading, the percentage who are reading with their children, and the shift is among the low and medium income families. So the line has shifted up for those families. So the folks at the top, the high income families, they could not read more. I mean, you know, almost all of them are reading 3 times a week already. So they kind of reached their ceiling. But what's happening is there's been a convergence in behavior. There's a convergence in what parents are doing. And it's not just reading, it's taking your children to the library. So the low income parents are shifting up, and they're coming up to a level that's comparable to what's going on with the high income. And the same thing with computer use. Same thing with computer use, using a computer at home for reading and math. So we think what's going on is all these messages about the importance of early childhood and reading to your children, talking to your children, taking your children to the library. These were adopted first by high-income, high-educated parents, but they're starting to diffuse to the rest of the population. So that's fabulous news, right? Because that means that these things will close gaps. And it's totally not what I had expected. I thought if we were seeing convergence, maybe it's the expansion of preschool in the United States, which is still not universal, but it's actually changes in what parents are doing. So that's a very important message. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is both of our countries should be committing to reduce educational inequalities. They're important because they cut across and they underlie other forms of economic and social inequality that we're going to be talking about today. And as rich nations, we can do better and we should do better. So I'll just say thanks to the funders, including Sutton Trust here in the UK.
Thanks. Well, I think my talk follows on very well from Jane's talk, because I'm going to be thinking about the issue of, given these gaps which we've seen in the UK and the US, and I'll be focusing on the UK, how do we understand what their significance is? And I'm particularly interested in emphasising that these are not just about life chances. They're not just about people's experiences, but they're also influencing all aspects of our social, political, and cultural life. And I want to begin with the issue of populism, because we do have this. And after the election last week, many of us were relieved to see populism turn to the left. But it's interesting to compare. A year ago, we had Nigel Farage, leader of UKIP at the time, saying that the Brexit result was about anything is possible if enough decent people are prepared to stand up against the establishment. We smashed the establishment. And then we had Jeremy Corbyn, who did fantastically well. The Labour vote increased far more than any other election, more than Tony Blair even, saying something very similar. We don't accept that it's natural for Britain to be governed by a ruling elite. One way of interpreting this kind of populism is to say this is about the gap. The gap we've seen growing in the UK has made this kind of pitch against the establishment attractive, powerful, pervasive. And I want to explore that as I go along. And I want to make the point that we have to situate our thinking in this tumult of populism. Many of you will be familiar with Donald Trump. His inauguration a few months ago, saying something very similar to Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. So are we experiencing a politics which is driven by this gap between the people doing well and the people left behind? And if so, how do we think about the dynamics between different social groups and different different economic groups. My final example, before I get on with my analysis, is an interesting one of Emmanuel Macron in France. And in a way, he's been elected recently, apparently on a different programme. He's not an obvious populist, but if you read this quote, which I took off the web, even he is being positioned as a figure of the establishment. So we have this particular quotation saying, France's newly elected leader, Emmanuel Macron, represents the European establishment. Former US President Barack Obama endorsed Macron. The EU endorsed Macron. So this issue of populism is influencing and affecting the way we think about political divides everywhere, even in those cases, as in France, where it doesn't appear, perhaps, to be obvious. And I want to try and, in my 10 minutes left, just think a bit about how that is positioned with respect to questions of inequality. Sorry, I've got to get to the beginning. Right. Sorry about the conclusions, a bit early there. I want to focus actually on one of the cohort studies which Jane talked about, one of the most famous cohort studies in the UK, the National Child Development Study. This is probably the most studied panel survey of all time. It's taken about 10,000 Britons born in 1958, and it's traced them through their lives. It's been a hugely influential study, including things like working out that if mothers smoked during pregnancy, that affected the health of their kids. But I was involved in a project a few years ago where we also did some in-depth interviews with a subsample of people from this panel survey. And I want to try and use those interviews to explore the meaning of being in different parts of these social and economic divides. I want to say a bit about the panel survey itself. It's an amazing resource. So when the kids were young, before the age of 14, we had lots of information about their medical situation, their parents, parental interest in their work. We have all their school tests recorded, maths and reading tests, teachers' assessments. We know their actual exam results. We know their family history, getting married, having kids. We know their job histories. So it's an amazingly rich data source as it's moved on. And in the most recent periods, we've also got information about their attitudes, including their political attitudes, their savings and such like. And right in the most recent period, we have 220 in-depth interviews which I conducted with some colleagues, which we can place in the context of these people's lives. Now, I need to emphasise, this is a group of people who are now about 60 years old. It's not typical of the population as a whole, so we're missing out younger people. It's just looking at people born in a particular week, which I think is really interesting because in a way they experience history the same. They've experienced the same historical events over the course of their life, and the kind of divisions which we can see in their lives are very telling for understanding divisions in British society as a whole. This is a bit of a complex diagram. I'll try and explain it quickly, but what we tried to do is we clustered those people born in the same week using a series of measures of their economic position and their, what we call their cultural capital, their educational resources, if you like. And this map basically clusters those respondents according to their to those issues, the economic issues and cultural issues. And as you can see, it separates out quite neatly. Key point I want to make is there's two axes here. It's not just a top-bottom axis, there's also a left-right axis, an x-axis and a y-axis. So in the top right-hand corner, you can see these are the people who are really well off. These are people who have in the top 5 percentile of pay and savings. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner, it's the opposite. These are the people economically deprived who are in the bottom percentiles of savings and pay. But we can also find a cultural division. So in the top left-hand corner, we can see kids whose parents left education after the age of 18. That is to say they were university graduates, which in 1958 was fairly unusual in the UK. And in the bottom right-hand corner, we got a group which you might call culturally deprived. So two axes here, two lines of separation, two kinds of destinies diverging. Do have to say the y-axis is the most important one, but the x-axis, as I'll go and show, is actually also quite important. And if you are, I'm influenced by the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and if you know his work, you'll see this is quite a familiar sort of model of how society is organised on two axes rather than just on one. And what we did is we formally clustered those respondents. Every dot here is an individual from that panel survey, and we clustered them, and we played around with various means of dividing them up. But this 10 cluster model seemed to do the best job. And here, as you can see in the middle, it's a mush. In the middle, it's a kind of multicoloured spectrum of delight. But there are these extreme classes. The group on the left, who are the highest paid, the group on the top right, whose parents are best educated, and the group at the bottom we're calling the precariat. And I'm going to focus on the contrast between those three groups. And the great advantage of this data source is it gives us a systematic way of sampling our in-depth interviews. So I can pull out all the interviews done with particular subsamples according to where they fit in this cluster. It's a very unusual resource, because if you're doing in-depth interviews, you often don't know systematically whether your interviews are representative or not. Okay, and what I want to try and argue is, my 5 minutes, 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left, is 7 minutes perhaps, is there's not just a division between top and bottom, but also between left and right. And that's actually very significant for understanding the dynamics of populism today. But also that we shouldn't always overemphasize the division between different groups in the population. So we got some attitude questions taken from the survey itself. And this is a question about the different clusters' view about their attitudes towards race. Would you mind working with other races? Would you mind if another race moved in next door? I wouldn't want another race for my boss. The interesting point is here, the precariat group is a bit lower. It's a bit more racist, if you want to use those terms. Not massively, and in general, the precariat tend to often tick ambivalent or no response boxes. There aren't huge differences here about racism. This is really important, because I think there is a view that it's the white working class who are kind of the ones who are anti-immigrant and driving the populist movement. It's not coming out of this data, because that's not obviously the case. All three groups were not racist particularly, according to these measures in 2008. When you look at attitudes towards politics, the gap between those groups grows. And you can see the precariat in green are much more likely to say, this is a few years ago, these questions, none of these political parties would do anything to benefit me. More likely to say on the right-hand side, there's not much difference which political parties empower. They may have a different view today, but this is 2008. There's more difference now between the top and the bottom, and a bit of difference too between the cultural elite and the business elite opening up. And these differences get even more marked when we have a question about economic equity, where we find the precariat grouping much more likely to say working people don't get a fair share of the nation's wealth. There's one law for the rich and another for the poor, and management always try to get the better of employees. And what's really interesting is the precariat, that most of them believe those things. Most of them don't think there's economic justice in the UK. Most of the business elite think it's okay. So this is where, on these questions, that's where you find these big divisions opening up. Now, in 3 minutes left, I just want to talk you through some of the testimonies we got from the in-depth interviews. One really telling visual we used is we got people to think about their lives, and we asked them this question: if you had to represent your life through a diagram, which of these would it be? Now, it's worth you doing this and thinking about which box you would tick. It's a bit of a strange exercise, but we then mapped on to those clusters the responses people chose. And it's quite a telling diagram, because as you can see at the bottom, the arrow people chose was pointing down. At the top, the arrow people chose was pointing up. this is a really, in some ways, a fantastic testimony to Destinies Diverging and people realising it in terms of how they think about their life. Having said that, I do find the one on the top left-hand side, the cultural elite, very interesting, because as you can see, the cultural elite have a very interesting life, lots of squiggles and ups and downs. Ultimately, it points down, which is, I think, a sign you like to be a bit sorry for yourself if you're part of the cultural elite. Nonetheless, it's very interesting how those visuals map on. I'm going to really rush through in the last minute just to talk through this issue of racism and nationalism, because nationalism is a key aspect of populist responses, but not quite in the way which is often portrayed, I think, because in fact, when you compare the interviews from respondents in our three clusters, they had a very different way of talking about the issues. The kinds of accounts they were giving were very different according to where they sat in that social space. So if we begin with our precariat group, the ones at the bottom, the ones in green, these are the kinds of accounts they came up with, and the key, I mean, it's a complex diagram, I'm sorry, I'm trying to squeeze too much in here, but the issue I would have focused upon is in red. Most of those people were ambivalent about nationalism. They were not strident nationalists. This was a few years ago. But actually, the majority of our in-depth interviews gave expressions which they sort of said, well, I'm not particularly nationalist. And in particular, they weren't nationalists when it came to swearing allegiance to the Queen or waving their flags. Insofar as they were nationalists, it was much more sensuous about the landscape, about particular experiences. The exception was the Scots. The Scots were nationalist, and the reason they were nationalist, I would argue, is because they had an establishment to kick against, i.e. England. But for the English at this point, that was not strong. This is not, in 2008 at least, this is not the strong nationalist or racist grouping. Let's skip over that. However, when you go towards our economic elite, it's a very different set of accounts. This is the group these are the best paid people. These are very cosmopolitan. They've often worked, globe-trotted. They've had senior management positions in different companies. And they were the ones who had a vision of what we call here Imperial nationalism. Britain is the best. And also, as you can see from the second quote in red, that could come out in forms of racism. Asians play the card a lot, i.e. they try and make excuses and they try and use the system to benefit themselves. I would say British is a leader. It leads the way for the rest of the world. So this is really, I think, important point that the kind of more nationalist, imperialist views are not coming from the precariat at the bottom. It's coming from a particular group of the economically advantaged. And as you can see from the bottom quote, that can lead to a kind of nostalgic view about how the good old days, these different coloured faces, some are good, some are bad. We just lost it. You can see Nigel Farage sort of vision of Britain there. The third cluster, this is the cultural elite, top left-hand side. It's interesting, again, because in a way, they have a very different take around issues of diversity and the nation, because they welcome multiculturalism. So this guy at the top is a white guy. I did a lot of equality and diversity stuff at work. I used to like that. It all fitted in beautifully. It was a black and minority-led association. It was my thing. Interesting, very strong investment in those issues. And at the bottom, we have a story from another senior manager, lots of cultural capital, about how important it was to kind of hold to account managers who were sexist and racist. I spent a lot of time getting people to sign compromise agreements so they couldn't take us to tribunal and paying them to go quietly to something stupid he said. Why is this important? Two ways, I think. One of them is to say, as well as the divergent destinies top and bottom, we're also seeing a fractionalization between the left and the right, and that is driving some of the tensions amongst political groups. So you can imagine the managerial multiculturalists loving getting at the business elite for their sexism and racism, and you could equally well find the business elite protesting against what the cultural elite are doing. This is really important because actually there's this body of very old argument in the sociology of elites saying that change happens and political dynamism happens not when you get a movement from below, but when the people at the top are divided. when there's a big dispute between different kinds of privileged groups, that's when you get social change. And I would argue that this is, in a sense, is happening in our survey. So, Diverging Destinies isn't just about life chances, it's about politics, it's about the nature of our society, it's about how our societies are changing, and that's all to do with accumulation of advantages, but it's also important to recognise that there's some degree of separation between cultural and economic advantages, and that's driving different sorts of visions of the nation, of politics, of the state and of government. Therefore, we need to avoid a kind of a simple story of, losers and winners. It's more complex than that. We need to avoid a language of reducing these differing destinies to to one variable, whether it's class or race or whatever, and recognise how these things fit together. Thank you.
Emma, please go for it.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. So I work for an EU agency. I don't know if it's safe to say that you're still a member. You might still be a member for quite a while. We'll see. And we are tasked to basically assist the policymakers in all the 28 countries at the moment with the development of social and employment policies by doing mainly comparative research in social and employment field. So everything that we do has a very strong comparative component. We don't go so much into a detail into the national aspects. And what I will share with you today is some of the work we have just finished. Literally, the report was published in May, where we looked at monitoring and what are the patterns of social mobility in the 25 countries that we had the data for. And when we started to really think about the project, which was about 3 or 4 years ago, we were inside very much influenced by what was happening in the US and in the UK, and we felt that, an idea of doing a project on social mobility would fly with our board quite easily. And just to say that on our board, we have representatives of all the governments, but in equal measures, we have the employers and the trade unions who have an equal say on how our budget is distributed. So we thought, it should fly quite easily. And in a way, to our surprise, there was not much appetite for a project. And they said, well, why is it really matter? Does it really, is it an important issue? And I think that also triggered us to reflect a little bit, that, yes, it is important, but we were asked and really tested to prove the evidence, why is it important? So the board would give us the money, most importantly, but also the resources in-house to carry out this huge project that took over 2 years. And of course, the arguments, why does it matter? Yes, there is a very clear, more so now, an economic argument about the human and skills loss of the generations of young people that we'll see throughout Europe not getting the jobs that they have inspired for or qualified for. The issue about inequalities was in a way tricky, because at that time there were some policymakers which were saying, well, perhaps we don't mind certain levels of inequalities as long as people have equal opportunities to achieve what they aspire to achieve. And I think that proved not to be correct, but that was a debate which we were a bit faced with. The social dimension, which I think over the years has grown and it became very, very important, about the breakup of communities and the lack of cohesion and the lack of support in public institutions. The political dimension, which Mike has been just talking about, I think it's huge throughout Europe. And I think this assumption that the governments at any level should work for both of us. And I think Mike talked greatly, it was very interesting about the US and the UK and France to a certain extent. And I think you also see in different aspects that happening in many countries. You see Hungary and Poland, the country I come from, moving really to the right. And it was driven by people's fears that they left behind, that the government that was in the past in power didn't represent them. It's something that happened in Spain, where they went to the left with Podemos. It's happening in Estonia, in some of the Nordic countries. So it's something that it's really very visible throughout Europe. The moral dimension, which I think is very linked to the political dimension, and it's something that the EU level has been working a lot about the social justice and the fairness of the different systems and whether the fairness exists. And the importance, finally, of perceptions and whether perceptions differ from reality. I think the consequences of people's perceptions are very real about the lack of opportunities, about lack of fairness. So with that, we were able to finally convince the board to give us the funding, and we could start work on it. And I think we were listening and hearing a lot about the American dream, and here I just have a quote of Michelle Obama, why I think Barack Obama was campaigning very hard for social mobility, because he was very much a product of it. But it was quite interesting. We had Bernie Sanders a couple of days ago in Dublin. He was attending one of the festivals which I'm involved in, and a large part of his speech he spent talking about actually American nightmare and how the different groups of the population are upset and angry. And then he was really reflecting that, in a way, the large pockets of people that voted for Trump, in a way, should have voted for the Democrats, because if you look at the demographics, he was reflecting why is it that they went to the right and not voting for him, essentially, and after Hillary. And in Europe, I think the social mobility, I think maybe as a term, hasn't been really so strongly visible. And yet, if you look at the European Foundation and the way the EU has been established, I think they are at the core. And here I have the quote from the Treaty of Rome, which is the foundation of the EU. And we very much are talking about improvement of living and working conditions of all people, and providing conditions that would equalize the chances of people in an upward direction. And maybe over the years, it has been lost somewhat. In the work that we have done, and I think that is not merely an academic discussion, but also very important for the policy making, it is important to differentiate between absolute and relative mobility when we try to measure it. Absolute mobility being looking at the aggregate and overall numbers of people that are moving up and are better off in terms of the income, in terms of occupation, or in terms of education than their parents. So we're basically talking about an overall improvement of living standards. And then on the other hand, we're talking about the relative social mobility, which is a chance of individuals, the chances of moving up or down on the occupation or income ladder. And I think that is also very important from a policy making. So this is what we attempted to do with our work. We used, in terms of the data from the European Social Survey, which is a fabulous and a very rich resource, and we used the 5 first waves. As a currency of social mobility, we used occupation, because that allowed us for a harmonized approach and a comparative approach covering 24 countries. And we first attempted to map the levels of absolute mobility. And in the report, you will find many more graphs and how we did that. But basically, we tried to find out whether this proverbial and a famous rising tide lifting all boats attributed sometimes to Kennedy, whether that was true. And I think we covered 3 cohorts. We looked at people born between 1925 to 1975, which is the Generation X. And in fact, first of all, we found that it's indeed largely because of the big societal and structural changes in the occupation, the extent of levels of upward social mobility, absolute social mobility prevailed over the downward mobility in most of the countries. And a second finding, which I find is quite interesting, is that the the more the societal structures change, the extent of absolute upward mobility between men and women becomes more similar. And of course, you know, there are many, many different factors why the levels were as they were, which can be mainly attributed to the economic growth, to the big changes in the labor market, moving from a more agriculture to service-oriented economy. But of course now, the situation is very different, and the economic growth has stalled in many countries, and despite the fact that in parts of Europe the economic crisis has stopped and the economic growth has picked up, there is still, I think we cannot really hope for the levels of economic growth we've had in the past. So in a way, the relative social mobility, what chances people have in the current economic and social situation to moving up, has become more important than ever. So moving really to the key of the theme of the sessions of the convergence, first of all, what you see, which I think, given the fact that social mobility was not really present in the policy documents a few years ago, if you look at some of the most important themes that have emerged just this year, you can see a fairly dramatic shift in how the governments essentially have started to turning their attention much more to social mobility. And this is just a quote from the Rome Declaration, which sadly has been only signed by the 27 countries, but nevertheless you see that there is a very strong emphasis on promotion of economic and social progress, as well as cohesion and convergence, meaning upward convergence. And then lastly, the document that just came out at the end of May, and it's sort of a reflection paper where Europe is going to go in terms of social dimension for the next 20 years. You can see that we see a very direct link and direct reference to social mobility, where we say that modern and cohesive society should be able, should allow for everyone to contribute fully and have access to new opportunities at different stages of life. And the different stages of life refer very much to the life course approach, which is becoming very important. But now moving to some of the data. First of all, the central question, has the convergence happened in terms of the relative social mobility? And what we see here, these are all the 24 countries grouped together, and you can see that certainly the level of convergence did happen, and upward convergence has happened for the cohorts born until before 46 and the baby boomers. But after that, you see very clearly that the patterns of convergence are fanning out. And I think it would be very interesting to see with the data that is becoming available now, whether these patterns continue to diverge. So you can clearly see in terms of a message that yes, we were converging in Europe, but that has stalled and something has happened, and we see now divergence. And that graphs, of course, shows us an overall picture, but then we also looked at different country patterns. And just to say here that because we use the occupational status as a measure for social mobility, here what you see is the levels of association. So if the graph is going down, the level of association between parents and the kids is going down, hence increase social mobility. And it's just actually occurred to me I should reverse that because I spent far too much time trying to explain that. But I think three main messages here. First of all, you have a group of countries where social mobility has been very high and it continues to be high. And here you have Belgium, you have Denmark, you have Finland, and you have Netherlands. And I think what is interesting here is that you don't really see a certain pattern or a group of similar countries, either bounded by welfare system, etc. So it will be, I think, very interesting to see what is happening in those countries, which allows for the levels of social mobility to continue to grow. Secondly, you have another group of countries where the social mobility has been increasing, but now, if you look at the generation X, the third generation, it certainly started to decrease. And here you have Austria, you have France, you have Sweden, you have also Germany. And I think particularly looking at Sweden and other two Nordic countries, you wonder what has happened that these Nordic countries, which has been always known for being very open and very equal, what has happened in Sweden that that pattern has been broken. And talking to some experts, they are looking at the major educational reform that happened, the increased segregation in the country that may lie behind these decreasing patterns of equal opportunities in Sweden. And the third group of countries where maybe a bit surprising are the post-socialist or post-communist countries, where a lot of people would have expected that after the transformation the equal opportunities would be bigger and wider, and that has certainly did not happen, and that is very visible in Poland, very visible in Hungary and Bulgaria, and I think that is something which is very interesting to see. Now, another point which I think also is very key, and something that I was quite surprised when we started to look into it, was that the most or a lot of previous research in terms of social mobility, both income and occupation, mainly focused on looking at fathers and sons relationships and extrapolating it for the whole country. And I think, yes, partly that was driven by the fact that fewer women were in the labor market, but I think nowadays it is very important to acknowledge that I think more research needs to be done that looks at these two groups separately. And I think UK is a very good example of that, because if we look at the overall country, the social mobility has decreased to a small extent, but you can see that when we look at men and women separately, there's a very dramatic difference. You see the men, especially the young men, where the social mobility has decreased really a lot, and you see women, which is the red line, where the social mobility has increased quite drastically. And I think in terms of the policy implications, that is something that needs to be borne in mind. And a similar story we'll observe in France, in Sweden, in Austria, Estonia, and Bulgaria. On the other hand, in countries where the overall levels of social mobility, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, both men and women experience higher level of social mobility. Now, very quickly, because I was waved the red card, just few themes that we have been picking up through our qualitative research in all the member states, looking a little bit what are the factors and concerns of different stakeholders in the different countries. It was quite confirmed that the social mobility is not a term, or hasn't been a term, that was often mentioned in the different countries. Yes, there are more concerns about the inequality, so debate is slightly differently framed. The fairness, and the fairness can manifest itself in terms of concerns over pensions, but it can also be framed in terms of intergenerational aspects and the future of youth. The squeezed middle classes, it's something that was very much discussed in many different countries. Concerns over social cohesion and the segregation, and that the place in which you grow up matters for your chances. And it was really, for us at least, surprising that it was the case very much in Italy and France, but also in fairly small countries such as Lithuania or Latvia, where that was becoming as one of the top concerns that people had. And finally, the diminishing role of education. And education, of course, has been studied and seen in many studies as a major lever in promoting equal opportunities. And yet there have been a number of studies, Shavit and his colleagues, the most well-known, covering the broadest countries, about the impact of educational expansion, which in their study they concluded thus benefits the better off parents than others. And I think there is much more, certainly the privatization of education, the value of qualifications certainly matters. And finally, the two other factors, and I think Jane has talked a lot about the influence of family. And I think it's fair to say that in Europe that has not been so much studied, and there hasn't been so much attention. And I was just wondering, is it because the institutional actors or public services were maybe responsible or are seen for providing the childcare, early education or education, but there is a huge shift now that the parenting and style of parenting really does matter. In related to that, I think the sticky top, which Abigail has done really a lot of work in the UK, and I think that is something that in other countries in Europe picking up on it. How can the policy and the governments react if you always have a very committed parents who really will do everything to push their kids, and how can then the public policy compensate for it? And finally, the whole issue of wealth. And there has been a lot of discussion that really, yes, it is about income, but it's not only about income, that income is not really enough, and it's much more about the wealth and the transmission of wealth, and how does wealth play in the determining social mobility. And finally, just one slide on resilience, because that's another buzzword that has come to the attention in many different countries. In all this very fast changing and in a very difficult social and economic environment, we just wanted to see, well, how resilient people are. And this is coming from our quality of life survey. This data is not yet released, so I'm just giving you a quick preview. But you can see here we put together how resilient the different countries are. And you can see that the most resilience we observe in Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. Again, some of the countries where the social mobility continues to rise. You can also see that there is a clear link with the levels of life satisfaction. But that is something that the data came literally a couple of weeks ago to us. So it's a field where we want to do a little bit more analysis on. So this is my last slide. More information about the country-specific findings for different cohorts and different men are in the report, which I would be happy to share. And just to say that we are now arguing and fighting with our board to give us more money to continue this work, because we would like to do some work on the wealth. There is really a fabulous data from the European Central Bank, which has been hugely underutilized, where you could do a lot of work mapping wealth concentration. So that's something that we would like to do, and I hope that the board will agree. And then I hope we will be able to do some work on fairness and perceptions. But that's to be seen. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, all three of you, very much for such a rich start to today's proceedings, with some, I would say, some glimmers of hope in there, in some of the evidence each of you have talked about, some surprises, perhaps. But underlying it all, really some quite depressing underlying issues about the perpetuation of gaps between different generations, and in some cases widening ones. So I think part of the theme of today is, well, what do we do about some of these challenges? And to lead off the discussion, Faiza Shaheen has kindly agreed to do that.
Great, thank you, and thank you so much for those presentations, which were really far-ranging. And there's really two things I just want to discuss broadly, and within that I'll talk a little bit about policy, which is too often the issue of social mobility is siloed to education policy and social policy. And secondly, that we need to think a bit more about what's happening at the top. So it was good there that Anna mentioned that. So on social mobility being siloed, and we heard some really good comments there on how this isn't just a matter of education. Of course, that's a big part of it, but it's also about family resources. And that is a lot to do with what's happening in terms of housing, in terms of what's happening in the labour market. There was a really interesting study done, I think it was the Resolution Foundation, that tracked people between 2002 and 2012 and found that those on low pay, 75% or 73%, almost 3/4 of them, never sustainably left that low pay sector, being on low pay. About 30% were on low pay the whole time, 10 years. And so that what's happening at the bottom of the labour market in terms of that precariousness is really fundamental to whether we will see social mobility in the future. You only have to look to the last era of where there was high social mobility to understand how important the labour market is. We focus so much on the kind of supply side, on education, on the skills of people going in. But what about the jobs available? And when we saw the last period of higher levels of social mobility, we saw an opening up, a large number of middle income jobs created. Now we see the opposite. We see the growth in low pay, the growth in high pay, and this reduction of jobs in the middle. It feels a bit sometimes we're having a conversation about one side of this equation and failing to recognize that we are effectively kind of pushing in a circular peg into a square hole. I mean, it's not going to match up. It doesn't match up right now. And you guys only need to go around and have conversations with people working in restaurants, serving your coffee, to recognize that there are a lot of people out there with graduate degrees, with other skills that they want to do, and unable to get that foothold at the high end. So when we see a polarization in the labor market, we can't see high levels of social mobility because the jobs are just not there. And I think that is very fundamental to what we think about in terms of policy. In countries like Germany and elsewhere where there is so levels of social mobility, they've done a lot to make sure that their manufacturing base is still there. They've done a lot to create green jobs, for instance. What should policy be doing to make sure that people have somewhere to go? Secondly, at the top end, look, I always think it's really interesting. We've had a period under New Labour where a lot of investment went into education. And over the same period, we know that the rich got a lot richer and fees at schools like Eton doubled. So there's a lot more resources going in at the top as well. And look, politically, it's not feasible to try and stop that happening and to close private schools and all the rest of it. But if you look at countries, again, where you see more social mobility, so Sweden is a really good example, Norway, etc., they have these extremely high-quality childcare systems that even rich parents put their kids into. So I think we need to be doing a lot more at that very, very early stage. Right now, we have a childcare system that is very expensive, doesn't have enough graduates in the classroom. I mean, it's weird when you think about, how much emphasis we put on teacher qualifications, and how we don't really think about that enough in childcare in those very, very essential early years. I'm not going to talk for long. I mean, again, on the top, I think we have to do something about free internships. We have to do something about, and this happens at kind of at a personal level as well, how people in high-income jobs, high-income positions, allow their friends' kids and their family kids to come in and get that experience, and, in that informal network kind of way. I've had awkward conversations with, friends that are lecturers and want their kids to come and do an internship with me, and I've just said, no, we have a formal system, and that is the way it has to be. And so we need to see that happening. We need to keep our eye out for that in our companies and the places that we work. Look, the reasons I focus at this end, it's not to say that education isn't important, of course it is, but I until we widen it out, until we recognize that in more equal societies you have higher levels of social mobility, it's quite simple, and that politicians too often use social mobility and the conversation about social mobility, which is incredibly emotive, to avoid doing anything about structural change, to say effectively, as long as we see people moving up, it's okay for people to be at the bottom and for it to be hard at the bottom. So we need to make sure that, if people are leaving behind people, that they're not leaving them behind in extremely difficult positions. So often we talk about social mobility as a failure of society, but it's also a failure of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jane, you talked a lot about education. I mean, your focus was on education, and a lot of your work is around improving parental investment at the bottom, which is where Pfizer ended. But how far can that take you? Are you actually just pushing people out into a system where there is no middle for people to rise up into?
Yeah, no, I actually totally agree with that. And I was thinking, as I was listening to the other talks, about the hollowing out that's occurred at the middle of the occupational and income distribution. So I'm really glad that we've come on to that. It's been a very important topic in the States. The work of David Otter and others has looked at the hollowing out of the income distribution in the middle. And there's also recent work showing that in terms of absolute mobility, it used to be about 80 or 90% of Americans could expect that their children would earn more than them in adulthood. So absolute mobility. It's now about a 50-50 chance that children will earn more than their parents. And it's the places where the middle's been hollowed out and where the chances are lower that your children will out-earn you and have higher incomes. Those are the places that voted for Trump in the recent election. So these things are absolutely tied to politics. So yeah, I think it's and. I think we have to improve educational opportunities so that children are not condemned to have the same educational attainment as their parents, because otherwise we're just perpetuating this. We have to improve educational attainment of children, but we also have to widen the opportunities once they come out of the educational system, and especially for that middle group. I mean, I was emphasizing the top and the bottom, but the middle group is a third, and that's the group actually where the opportunities have eroded. And where we could do something about it, and we could learn from other countries that have much stronger apprenticeship systems and vocational educational systems. These are the folks who are not going on to university. Not everybody will, and there need to be better job opportunities. So it's both improving skills but also improving opportunities.
I mean, if I can just pick up one of the points Pfizer made about the issue about people at the bottom, because we are surrounded by images of particular images of people at the bottom, welfare benefit claimants and such like, as if they're the problem to be solved. And it's very, very interesting doing our work on the National Child Development Survey that precariat group, those people in green, if you remember those at the bottom, and we looked in detail about the nature of their lives. Out of the in-depth interviews we looked at, I mean, only one of the 20 or so was unemployed. They were nearly all working, just working in incredibly badly paid minimum wage sort of work, even though these are 50-odd years old. The majority of them were living, they were not council tenants, the majority of them were living in own-occupied housing of various kinds. So they're very much of the system. And in some ways, they were very fully engaged in the labour market and the housing market, but that didn't stop them from being fundamentally getting a very raw deal. So I think it is really important for us to kind of question some of the meritocratic ideas that if you work hard enough or get enough qualifications, the doors will be open to you, because some people have done that and have tried to do that and they haven't always succeeded.
I mean, Anna, you mentioned in passing that in some of your countries you see a diminishing role of education. Could you enlarge on that a little bit? As to how that ties in with what we've just been saying.
Well, I think it's very much tying in with what Pfizer just said, that if I look at Poland, for example, in the past, but I think also in the UK, you had 10-20% of people entering tertiary education, which then guaranteed a good and well-paid job. At the moment, if you look at the young kids, you have 50-60% of the population finishing high-level education in many countries with huge debts linked to it, and what they enter into are fairly unstable and fairly protracted jobs. And you have this, I think that the whole aspect of transition, which in the past I think was fairly predictable, that you finished school, you found yourself, maybe you went through internships, but then you entered into a permanent stable job, which then allowed you a proper transitions into adulthood of getting a home and starting a family. That's all gone, and I think that transitions are much more protracted, and you have this boomerang generation of people moving back and forward. And in terms of the solutions, I think, yes, the better matching is a key. I think what also works, which we did a study on sub-transitions, what seems to be quite effective is when people combine work with studying. So in many countries, you study, you don't work, and then you try to find work. And you have countries, Nordic countries, but also Germany, where you combine work with studying, and that links you to a labor market much closer. And you're not relying so much on the social networks, the informal networks, which then, you're lucky if you have them, you're unlucky if you don't. And maybe on the bottom, I would say, Eugene mentioned about increasing the income levels of the bottom group in a society, and I'll just be also interested where the debate about the universal income will take us, and whether we will be, there's a lot of resistance to it. In Switzerland it was just rejected, but I just wonder whether people and the policymaker needs to be a bit more creative and reflect on the universal income to be a buffer zone.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions, and I can see Lisa McKenzie waving at the back. Do we have any microphones with us? I think Lisa can probably shout. Yeah, we do have some mics. Actually, I think it'd be helpful for the recording if you did use the mic, Lisa, if you don't mind. And Lisa, it's more in the form of questions rather than a long speech.
I know, it's not long. It's not long, honestly, it's not long. In fact, it's very short. I'm Lisa McKenzie. I'm in sociology here at the LSE. First thing I want to say is, how many times can I sit in a room and listen to this? Because how many times have I heard this on and on and on? Inequality, poverty, it's about what are the working class doing? What can we do to them? I can't hear it anymore without saying, how many times are we going to keep saying this? So we talk about people at the bottom. What should we do to them? But we know that the middle class game the system. You've all said it today. You've all explained how the system is gamed. Universities like this one are very much part of that gaming of that system. So I don't really want to hear it anymore. I listen to this research constantly, every single day. But we sit here and we keep allowing this to happen. You're allowing it, we're allowing it. We know that it's being gamed. Can we have a different game, please?
Mike, could you just enlarge a bit on what you were saying in terms of the divergence of the top? Because Mike was talking, in the end of what he was talking about this split in attitudes at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the really important issues about focusing on the question of inequality rather than say poverty is to say it is a dynamic, and you need to look at what's going on at the top and how rich and privileged people protect themselves as part of the picture of social dynamics. And so, I agree with you, Lisa. And there's lots of data showing that, say, if you take the issue about university graduates, a crucial feature in terms of whether you turn your qualification, your degree into a really high-paying job is actually which university you went to. So you can get a high-quality education at a certain university which isn't very famous and reputable, get a similar education at a different university, and doors are open to you. So absolutely, we need to recognise that, and it's a challenge. LSE is a very elite institution, and this is where I work. I do think, to say, linking it back to the Atlantic Fellows Programme, this is why I think we take this as a very serious attempt to think seriously about how we try and challenge some of those institutional elitist cultures, and think about how an evidently elite institution like the LSE can think about doing things differently. So I think it's a challenge to all of us, and you're right to put it on the table. I haven't got an obvious answer at one level, but I think we are aware of it.
And I think Anna talked about what she called the stickiness at the top, and in the States we talk a lot about the rat race for investments in children, and that you saw that in the expenditure graph, where it's not that low-income families have been disinvesting, it's that high-income families have taken off and are just pouring more and more resources in. Richard Reeves, who used to be in the UK and is now in the States, has a new book on this. I think it's called Dream Hoarders, where he talks about the top 20% of the income distribution and things like internships that people use to enhance opportunities for their children at the top and that underlie the stickiness. And that's getting a lot of attention in the States.
Can I just say something? Just quickly on that. I think sometimes the whole way in which the social mobility narrative plays out is that it sort of plays into the framing that being working class is somehow a bad thing, is something to escape from. And it feels like it's gone so far down that road. I don't even know how we start bringing it back. But certainly talking about gaming the system. And I think, actually, Mike, you put a graph up there asking people if they would want to work with someone that's another race, etc. I find that stuff really problematic because people, tend to not answer those questions honestly. But also, we have this whole narrative of it's the white working class are racist. They're not the ones making decisions about where public spending cuts are going to be, which hurt ethnic minority women the most. They're not making the decisions about who gets a job. So they're not looking at those CVs, and we know that still, even with the same qualifications, people of colour, people with Muslim names, African-sounding names, are less likely to get called for an interview. That's not the white working class making those decisions. And so I think, you're right, and we have to absolutely make sure that we are not playing into some of these class narratives that are wrong and very destructive.
Thank you. There was a gentleman in about the sixth row back.
Hi. I sympathise with everything that's been said, save for the fact that if you look at the global situation and you give some support to the view that there's a secular stagnation in terms of where the world is in terms of its growth prospects, then you can understand some of these problems in a wider context than simply the policy of individual countries. Around the world today, we have a problem of growth, of insufficient growth, of insufficient investment. It's not unique to Europe or to the US. Certain countries are growing, but not sufficiently to pull the rest up. And in that situation, we really have left a regime, an environment which we enjoyed for over 100 years, from industrial revolution, post-industrial revolution, information revolution. And now we're confronting an environment which really was the environment that existed prior to this, of slower growth, slower investment, less opportunities. So when we rail against a policy which is not creating enough jobs, which I agree with you is at the core of the problem, this is a phenomenon of growth around the world which it's very difficult to resolve at the moment. The debt levels are too high. There's problems of aging. There are major problems everywhere, and there's no solution to it. Now, even if you don't agree with the secular stagnation problem and the secular stagnation hypothesis, you have to accept that for the last 10 years, growth has just been unsatisfactory. And in that environment, that's why we are confronting an exacerbation of the inequality problem.
Thank you. Would you mind passing the microphone forward? And then I think we'll take a last comment from Abigail McKnight.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, Abigail McKnight, case at the LSE. Anna mentioned some of my work that I've been doing on downward mobility and glass floors. And I'm currently doing some work with Richard Reeves, who will be doing some US-UK comparisons. I think we need to move away from thinking about this hollowing out of the occupational distribution, because I'm not sure if it's actually characterising properly what's happening at the moment, which is that room at the top, as we describe it, is no longer expanding in the way that it used to expand. And that's very important for social mobility because it allowed absolute social mobility. So by gaining a good education, you could achieve and move upwards. With opportunity hoarding and very high levels of inequality where parents have different amounts of money they can spend investing in their children, they will continue to try and now capture a smaller share of these well-paid jobs. And that's going to affect not just absolute mobility, but relative mobility overall. And I think that move now to thinking about other things going on in the labour market rather than this hollowing out, which actually doesn't really describe what's happening in the UK at the moment anyway, is important for understanding what's happening for mobility.
Thank you. We started a little late. We should try and finish, but are there any final comments the four of you would like to make before we break?
Just maybe very quickly, very much agreeing with Abigail, and I think that's where public policy comes into place. And I was quite struck when we were interviewing some of the people in the UK, and we were interviewing some of the employers, and then the governments. And the people from the governments were saying to us, well, but you know, it's not our business to tell companies how to run their business or how to recruit people. And we were saying, well, maybe it should be. Because clearly you're not pulling from a very diverse pool of people that you could. So I think, you know, the public policy will always do a catch-up with parents, but I think there is a play for public policy and the government to try to address it.
I mean, I guess just looking forward and on the seismic shifts that we're having, you know, we didn't have too much debt to bail out the banks. And we're so reluctant to do it to rejig and recalibrate our economy ready for climate change, demographic change, technological change, automation. All of these issues we're talking about become slightly defunct in the world in which, you know, 40% of the jobs have been automated. And we have to think in a much more forward-looking kind of way and when we talk about these things and the policies that come for that, and we have to be willing to make that investment now. We're not paying even for the upkeep right now, and the world as a whole needs to make a decision to really go for it.
Just one quick comment about the issue about growth. I mean, you know, I think certainly I'm not an economist, but I think the whole kind of Piketty argument about actually, you know, the accumulation on capital is higher than the growth rate, and that tends to be a trend is really important for us to think about. Actually, one thing which I think all of us did, we relativised our findings. That is to say, we were looking at relative chances of different groups. Actually, if you take into account the absolute accumulation of wealth, that really actually massively enhances the gap between the rich and the poor. It makes it just so much harder to get from the bottom to the top than it was the case 20, 30, 40 years ago. Growth makes that problem worse, it seems to me. It doesn't help that problem. And I think we need to think about it. So the dynamic about the top and the bottom is something we need to take very seriously.
I guess the message I take away from the last two comments is that the picture is even gloomier than what we painted, and that there are other forces leading to diverging destinies, the slow growth, the shrinking opportunities at the top, which just means all the more important for public policy and for all of us to be thinking about measures to combat those forces, because otherwise, if left unchecked, we're going to see continued fanning out, which is not what any of us want to see.
Well, thank you all very much. We started a little late. I think, could you please be back here? We've got only a short break now to start promptly at 11:50, so that's 10 minutes behind the schedule. And the themes that follow in the doctoral student presentations follow directly from what we've just been talking about. Parenting, labour markets, and segregation. So see you in 10 minutes.